Hi, welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to look at Philip K. Dick's book, We Can Build You. Initially, it was written in 1962 under the title The First in Your Family. The novel was rejected by all kinds of publishers before it got serialized and first published in November 1969 and January 1970 in the issues of a magazine called Amazing Stories. The title there was A Lincoln Simulacrum. Ted White, the editor at the time, added a last chapter, chapter 19, because he thought the novel was missing a proper ending, like so many other editors, which was why they didn't publish it. Finally, in 1972, Don Wollheim of DAW Books acquired the story and published it under its current title, We Can Build You, in its original form, without that 19th additional chapter. For this review, I read the 18-chapter version, but you can find a link in the description box to that ominous 19th chapter, if you wish to read that as well. We Can Build You is set in the year 1982. It centers on the character Louis Rosen, a small businessman whose company produces spinets and electronic organs. Rosen's partner wants to begin production of Simulacra, or androids, based on famous Civil War figures. The firm completes two prototypes, one of Edwin M. Stanton and one of Abraham Lincoln. Rosen then attempts to sell the robot patents to Sam K. Barrows, an influential businessman who is opening up lunar real estate for purchase and for colonization. Barrows is a kind of Elon Musk character, if you will. He plans to use Simulacra colonists to entice human settlement on the moon and other human interplanetary colonies within the solar system. Louis Rosen, the protagonist, develops feelings for a female character called Pris Frauenzimmer, the schizophrenic daughter of his business partner, who has actually designed both Simulacra. This becomes an obsession, and Louis begins to hallucinate about being in a relationship with Pris. The remainder of the book deals with Louis Rosen's admission of schizophrenia and his Jungian therapeutic treatment at a federal clinic. There's a bit of a backstory to the Lincoln Simulacrum. Dick had originally written, as we know, the novel in 1962, and in 1964 actually the Walt Disney Company developed a groundbreaking audio animatronic figure of Abraham Lincoln for the state of Illinois pavilion at the New York World's Fair. This attraction, titled Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln, featured a lifelike robotic Lincoln delivering a speech compiled from his historical addresses. The figure's realistic movements and speech were unprecedented at the time, marking a significant advancement in animatronics technology. So it debuted in 1964 at the New York World's Fair and was later incorporated into Disneyland. Because Dick's novel was only first published in 1969, Disney had publicly beat him to the idea, which irked him. In an interview, Dick said, "I wrote that novel before Disney even proposed to build the Lincoln Simulacrum. I couldn't sell it for years and years, and I wrote it while I was trying to fuse my mainstream stuff with my science fiction stuff, so it's not quite science fiction in the usual sense of the word. I have seen the Lincoln Simulacrum down there. I cut out the notice in the newspaper that Disney planned to build the Lincoln Simulacrum and pasted it up on the wall of my study. I remember doing that because the novel had already been written. So he built it, and I went to Disneyland and looked at the goddamn thing." So the novel begins with a seemingly innocuous innovation. A company producing electronic organs pivots to manufacturing android replicants. Unlike the androids in, for instance, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, these simulacra are not meant to integrate seamlessly into society. They are historical emulations designed to reenact cultural memory. However, this goal proves impossible. Stanton, a secondary historical figure, adapts functionally, while Lincoln, the mythologized symbol of American trauma and unity, is unable to adapt to contemporary society, partially due to the original Lincoln's own psychological complexities. In the novel, both the Lincoln and the Stanton simulacra exhibit more rational and compassionate behavior than many of the human characters in the novel. This inversion challenges the reader to actually reconsider notions of humanity and artificial intelligence. The simulacra, human-like qualities, juxtaposed with the flawed humanity of the living characters, serve to question the nature of consciousness and the criteria of personhood once more. The psychological core of We Can Build You lies in the character of Louis Rosen and his obsessive imagined relationship with Priest Frauenzimmer, the mentally ill designer of the simulacra. Priest is schizophrenic, recently released from a federal psychiatric institution, and yet portrayed with both intellectual brilliance and interpersonal cruelty. Her schizophrenia functions not simply as a clinical diagnosis, but as a metaphor for the fragmentation of selfhood in a simulated society. In my personal opinion, the character of Priest is more of a study of autism than schizophrenia. While Philip K. Dick labelled her condition as schizophrenia in the text, a close phenomenological reading does support the interpretation that Priest could more plausibly be understood as autistic, particularly when assessed through modern frameworks. Priest demonstrates deep cognitive activity but has pronounced difficulty with typical social cues, interpersonal reciprocity, and affective resonance. Schizophrenia typically involves hallucinations, delusions, and thought disorder. Priest doesn't show florid psychosis, but rather flat affect, hyperfocus, and selective withdrawal. The rigidity and intense focus, especially in her interactions with simulacra, and her resistance to conventional norms, resemble autistic monotropism and sensory social overwhelm, not psychotic fragmentation. Priest's language is often literal, awkward, or tangential, traits that align with ASD rather than disorganized or delusional speech typical of schizophrenia. She also exhibits a form of cognitive empathy deficit, not emotional coldness or disregard, another trait more consistent with ASD. She appears internally overwhelmed rather than externally fragmented, given that Priest is emotionally intense, systematically minded, and struggles with performative neurotypical behavior, especially under institutional demands. It's plausible that she embodies what we might now call a non-conforming autistic woman rather than someone truly schizophrenic. As in many of PKD's books, many of the quote-unquote schizophrenic traits in We Can Build You reflect not schizophrenia per DSM definitions, but Dick's own liminal neurodivergent phenomenology. Dick experienced recurring episodes where he believed he was living in multiple realities simultaneously, famously chronicled in the Exegesis. Rather than being classic delusions, these episodes were often self-reflective, philosophical, and sometimes mystical in nature. Further, PKD describes states of extreme sensory awareness where Colors, light, or sound became overwhelming to him. He often experienced hyperempathy, auditory sensitivity, and difficulty filtering stimuli, traits now associated with sensory processing issues, more characteristic of autism or high openness creativity than schizophrenia. He was also socially eccentric. He had difficulty with emotional regulation in relationships and repeatedly described himself as unable to read people. His intense and sometimes volatile romantic relationships and friendships suggest social naivety rather than classic schizophrenic detachment or anhedonia. Characters in PKD's novels often obsess over metaphysical systems, abstract patterns, or internal narratives, and other behaviour treated as pathological. PKD wrote thousands of pages of metaphysical speculation in his exegesis, exploring theories of time, identity, theology, and simulation. These were obsessive, yes, but structured and reflective. In the book, the Pris character swings between intense emotional closeness and sudden hostility. Dick's letters and biographies describe emotional instability likely tied to trauma, drug use, and unresolved grief. These traits resemble affective dysregulation or complex PTSD more than schizophrenia per se. The Rosen character's descent into delusion parallels the android's ontological failure. As his relationship with Pris deepens, reality itself becomes porous. He hallucinates a life with her, marriage, children, aging, within a virtual mental landscape constructed during therapy at the federal clinic. These episodes are not presented as mere lapses of reason, but as structural symptoms of the world that Dick envisions, where consciousness itself is a simulated construct that is easily destabilized. In philosophical terms, Dick's narrative presages cognitive science models like Thomas Metzinger's phenomenal self model, which argues that the self is a transcendent brain-generated illusion. Just as the androids simulate identity without essence, Rosen's mind simulates a self-world relation that collapses under emotional and ontological strain. In addition to psychological fragmentation, We Can Build You explores existential absence through what could be termed a zero-person perspective, a mode of subjectivity in which the narrative self dissolves. This theme resonates with existential phenomenology, particularly Sartre's notion in the transcendence of the ego, that the ego is not a given substance but an emergent function. Rosen's trajectory, his institutionalization, delusional withdrawal, and ambiguous release maps the erasure and hesitant reconstruction of personhood. Notably, Dick does not restore Rosen to a stable identity. The novel ends in epistemic suspension. Rosen is freed from the clinic, but his grip on reality remains tenuous, and Pris too is re-institutionalized. There is no redemption, no final truth, only the unsettling question of whether Rosen was ever sane to begin with. The unresolved ending of the novel is more than narrative irony. It affirms Dick's core epistemological skepticism that identity, perception, and even reality itself may be provisional, contingent, and constructed. In this sense, We Can Build You anticipates post-structuralist critiques of the stable subject and foregrounds a philosophical mood closer to anti-foundationalism than to traditional science fiction's technocratic optimism. Overlaying the psychological and ontological themes, is a critique of late capitalism's totalizing logic. Sam K. Barrows, a businessman seeking to use Simulacra to market lunar colonization, represents the intrusion of capital into the sacred. The androids meant to evoke national reverence become marketing tools, avatars of expansion. Prison's vision of the Simulacra as historical educators is quickly overridden by Barrow's corporate ambition. Dick thus anticipates the cultural critiques of Herbert Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man and Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle. In Dick's imagined future, even identity, memory and consciousness are not exempt from commodification. Androids become instruments of conformity and market logic, mirroring the psychic enclosure of neurotypical capitalism. This move into symbolic capitalism is a subtle but potent philosophical intervention, where traditional science fiction often just explores the ethics of artificial intelligence. Dick asks what kind of society would reduce identity itself to a consumable, and what kind of mind could survive in such a world. The answer, of course, is the world we're living in today. Despite being less well known than other works in Dick's corpus, We Can Build You deserves serious attention. It is a novel that destabilizes its own categories. Not quite science fiction, not quite mainstream fiction, not quite coherent in plot, yet deeply coherent in theme. It refuses the comforts of resolution, instead confronting readers with the instability of memory, identity and sanity in a postmodern world. In staging a metaphysical drama where androids, schizophrenics and capitalists converge, Dick offers not only a prescient vision of contemporary neuropolitics, but a speculative diagnosis of the post-human condition. We Can Build You thus emerges as a literary X-ray of the fragmented self, trapped between simulation and sensation, desperately seeking meaning in a universe that might only be pretending to exist. Personally, I loved reading this book and I give it a 5 out of 5. If you liked this video, please like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye bye.